The UN and prominent scientific organizations say the science is settled. No one can dispute that climate change is mainly caused by humans. Those who question it are insulted and shunned, which is exactly the way the scientific method is supposed to work. Welcome to America Uncovered. I'm Chris Chappell. Everywhere you look these days, it seems like there's someone pushing the narrative. America is irredeemably racist. Christopher Columbus was evil. Pineapple on pizza is gross. Wrong. Its sweet tanginess is a great counterbalance to the salt and acidity of the sauce. Refine your palates, you swine. Journalists push narratives all the time, but so do scientists. Now, there's this naive notion that scientists are above pushing narratives because all they do is look at provable facts. But that couldn't be further from the truth, especially for complex topics where the facts aren't always so clear-cut. Look no further than the climate change debate. The most influential scientific organizations make it sound like it's a fact supported almost unanimously by the scientific community that climate change is mostly man-made, which should immediately make you start questioning things, since no community unanimously believes anything. If they did, then 10 out of 10 dentists would recommend Crest. Just look at how the UN presents the topic. According to the UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change 2023 report, human activities are responsible for global warming by increasing greenhouse gases. It is unequivocal that human influence has warmed the atmosphere, ocean, and land. In other words, don't question it. You have to accept that humans are the driving factor for climate change. There's not supposed to be debate in science. That's why we still believe the Earth is in the center of the universe and everything revolves around it. That science was settled centuries ago. This type of messaging has a profound impact on public policy all over the world. Billions of dollars have gone into addressing climate change and studying its effects. The narrative about man-made climate change is so loud and pervasive that CNN can ask, why are we still debating climate change, and reasonably expect readers to say yeah. In reality, though, it's a lot more complicated than that. I've debunked the 97% of scientists agree on man-made climate change narrative in a previous episode. The reality is there's no consensus on how large a role human activity plays in climate change or even how climate is changing. Now, I've said this before and I'll say it again. I'm not a conspiracy theorist, and I'm not taking sides on the climate change debate either. I'm not necessarily dismissing the idea that mankind is driving climate change, but I'm not going to say that everything's settled because it's not. Oh no, I just said something nuanced. You know what that means? Goodbye YouTube ad revenue. And that is exactly the problem. It's not very popular to question the climate change narrative, especially when billions of dollars are on the line. But there are some scientists who question the narrative anyway. One of the most prominent voices is Willie Soon, a Malaysian astrophysicist and aerospace engineer who used to work at the Harvard-Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics. Soon is known for promoting the hypothesis that the sun may have more to do with current climate change than human activity. He's not necessarily saying there's no such thing as man-made climate change, but he is very vocal about how the UN reportedly suppresses the sun's role in climate change. I should have known the sun was diabolical. After all, it kills me every time I play Super Mario 3. Over the years, Soon's research has been attacked by other scientists and the mainstream media. Carbon Brief released an explainer pushing back against the idea that the sun is responsible for recent climate change. Slate said that Soon's science has been refuted. Because the science is in, it's extremely clear, and the consensus among climate scientists is solid. 10 out of 10 scientists agree. The Union of Concerned Scientists, the Imperial College London, the World Meteorological Organization, and a whole bunch more organizations all say the same thing. NASA is especially adamant about shutting down the sun theory. In its explainer, NASA says the sun can influence Earth's climate, but it isn't responsible for the warming trend we've seen over recent decades. The warming we've seen in recent decades is too rapid to be linked to changes in Earth's orbit and too large to be caused by solar activity. Okay, but what about when it chases you through the desert levels? Explain that, science. NASA and other scientific organizations argue that there isn't any increase in solar energy reaching the planet.
So there is a line, and the scientific community is well in agreement. According to NASA, scientists agree that the solar cycle is not driving the changes in Earth's climate that we're currently seeing. If we saw solar radiation increasing for a long period of time, we could see those effects in our climate. But the changes between solar cycles are pretty small and not able to drive the drastic changes we've seen over the past few decades.
Plus, if there were so many solar rays, then how come we don't have a real-life Fantastic Four, Science settled. Keep an eye on NASA. There is a reason why NASA, in particular, is vocal in debunking the sun theory, which I'll get to later in this episode. Now, this is how science works. One scientist puts out research, and other scientists challenge the results. But apparently, refuting Soon's science wasn't enough. Scientific community and the mainstream media went after Soon personally, and not always in the most honest of ways. I'll tell you more after the break. Welcome back. Scientists and the mainstream media have attacked Soon's research on the sun's role in climate change, but they've also attacked Soon. And it can be a bit disingenuous. For example, in 2011, the environmentalist nonprofit Greenpeace began pushing the idea that Soon's research was funded by the fossil fuel industry and suggested that Soon improperly concealed his funding sources in one of his publications. But that's misleading. According to the Heartland Institute, as a working scientist, Soon had no authority to sign a research contract to receive a grant, let alone to decide and dictate the terms of such contracts. Who did have the authority? Soon's employer. Dr. Soon and other working scientists like him are paid by the Smithsonian, not by the external funder, to carry out those duties. Simply put, Dr. Soon is employed by the Smithsonian to conduct research paid for by external grants obtained by the Smithsonian. So if true, it would have been the Smithsonian that accepted money from the fossil fuel industry. Meanwhile, the Union of Concerned Scientists suggests that Soon's work was part of a broader pattern of deception by fossil fuel companies. And as for the mainstream media, well, they have disdainfully called Soon a climate skeptic. The problem is, Soon isn't the only scientist asking questions. In 2021, Soon, along with almost 24 other scientists from all over the world, published a study on the Institute of Physics Publishing asking how much has the sun influenced northern hemisphere temperature trends. They called it an ongoing debate. It's a pretty dense read. But to summarize, the study points to solar radiation on the Earth's atmosphere as the driver of global warming and cites dozens of other studies that point to the sun, not human activity, as the primary driver of climate change. The study was arguing that the way the UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change concluded that climate change was man-made was flawed. It ignored data such as NASA's sun monitoring satellite data, which the authors argued would have countered the man-made climate change narrative. According to the lead study author, Ronan Connolly, depending on which published data and studies you use, you can show that all of the warming is caused by the sun, but the IPCC uses a different data set to come up with the opposite conclusion. Climate is seriously complex, and there's a lot of data to consider, so this could just be a mistake. But Connolly doesn't seem to think so. In their insistence on forcing a so-called scientific consensus, the IPCC seems to have decided to consider only those data sets and studies that support their chosen narrative. That didn't sit well with most climate change scientists. One 2022 study tried to debunk the sun theory as erroneous. Those authors pretty much argued it was a waste of time that could be better used on areas of legitimate scientific uncertainty. However, Soon and various other scientists came out with 3 new studies earlier this year that say otherwise. This one looked at data sets that the UN didn't look into to conclude that the UN underestimated the sun's role in global warming. This included data from NASA's satellites, which is a pretty big flex, using data from an organization that doesn't agree with you to prove your point. This study also argues that the UN underestimated how weather stations are impacted by urbanization, which generates heat from human activity. It's similar to the conclusions made by this study, which specifically addressed the 2022 study that criticized the sun theory. This other study specifically compared Japan and the US to show the impact that urbanization has on weather station data collection. So they're essentially saying that the way they collect data was flawed, and so were their conclusions. Especially noted scientist Nelly, whose recommendation for it getting hot in here is to take off all your clothes. Now, the studies aren't completely dismissing the idea that climate change is man-made. They're simply saying that there isn't enough data to determine whether global warming is mostly man-made, mostly natural, or a combination of both, which is why Willie Soon is one of thousands of scientists who have signed the World Climate Declaration, which says there is no climate emergency, and that natural as well as anthropogenic factors cause warming. One of the scientists involved in the research said the analysis opens the door to a proper scientific investigation into the causes of climate change. But it turns out certain scientists are absolutely livid about these studies. They want to slam that door shut, barricade it, and put up a "get off my lawn" sign. I'll tell you more after the break. Welcome back. Some scientists are angry about the multiple studies done by Soon and his colleagues regarding the sun's role in climate change, and they're making their displeasure known. But the way these scientists speak to other scientists makes them sound more like fourth-grade bullies than professional researchers. For example, atmospheric science professor Michael Mann of Pennsylvania State University, the guy famous for what's called the hockey stick graph, referred to the authors of one of the studies as a group of climate denier clowns, which is ridiculous because clowns aren't climate deniers. They're better than anyone at reducing emissions by carpooling with 30 of them in a single vehicle. Mann also apparently sees anyone who he classifies as a climate denier of being truly awful human beings. I don't remember the part of the scientific method where you call anyone who questions you names. Oh wait, there it is. Many climate scientists are quick to dismiss studies that don't align with the climate change narrative. For example, Gareth Jones of UK's Meteorologist's Office called a review that disagreed with him nonsense. Jones also seems to enjoy smearing people like the editor of the journal Climate, saying that he has a bit of a reputation, so much so that other climate contrarians distance themselves from him. Considering how childish they're acting, I'm surprised he didn't say the reason they distance from him is because he smells. Then there's Gavin Schmidt, the director of the NASA Goddard Institute for Space Studies. He mocked one of the authors, calling his work BS. Schmidt also said the only point of this paper, which every climate denier and their dog has jumped onto, is to launder dirty science into a clean, made-for-Fox meme. Dirty science? Is that like weird science if it was rated R instead of PG-13? Schmidt is even using a Freedom of Information Act request to demand one of the editor's emails with relevant scientists. It seems like a lot of intimidation to try and coerce uniformity in the scientific community rather than allowing for disagreement to try and get the facts. Which makes me respect that one dentist that always disagrees with the other 9. Can't imagine what kind of terrifying tactics they're using to try and get him to fall in line. Climatologist Judas Curry at Georgia Institute of Technology told the Epoch Times that the response by Schmidt, Mann, and others, particularly with regard to the FOIA request regarding editorial discussions on the paper, reflects their ongoing attempts to control the scientific as well as public dialogue on climate change. If you ask me, this also reflects just how arrogant people in the scientific community have become. For example, the UN's Undersecretary General for Global Communications last year had the audacity to say that the UN owns the science. She even admitted that the UN was working with Google to manipulate search results.
We partnered with Google, for example. If you Google climate change, you will, at the top of your search, you will get all kinds of UN resources. We started this partnership when we were shocked to see that when we Googled climate change, we were getting incredibly distorted information right at the top. So we're becoming much more proactive. We own the science, and we think that the world, should know it.
Own the science? How arrogant do you have to be to believe that you own science? What, are they going to have a garage sale and try to get people to buy the theory of gravity from them since they own it? It's this kind of ownership that allows for organizations like the UN to preemptively silence dissent with very little regard for both free speech or even science itself. You'd be very, very mistaken if you believe that scientists are above politics and bias, or that they should not be questioned. Let's not forget that politicians and scientists said there was zero evidence COVID came from a lab leak, and that lockdowns were the best way to deal with the pandemic despite warnings to the contrary. The people pushing those narratives thought they couldn't possibly be wrong, but in hindsight they look pretty foolish. Trying to coerce people to a consensus of what you think the science isn't real science. Real science would acknowledge that scientists don't always have all the data and examine different approaches with professionalism. Of course, there are going to be people who believe in disinformation, but what's to stop organizations as powerful as the UN from spreading their own disinformation? If we have scientists who are trying to spin facts that favor corporate interests in fossil fuels, tobacco, and fast food, then don't you think the same could happen for the interests of climate change activists? People will spread disinformation about anything, even things that are obviously false, like pineapple on pizza being anything less than amazing. Like climate change scientists, YouTube loves restricting debate and discussion about things it finds too controversial, such as climate change. That's why we need your support for America Uncovered with voluntary contributions on patreon.com. Click that orange button to keep the debate going. And if you want to learn more in depth about the 97% myth, click on this video. Once again, I'm Chris Chappell. Thanks for watching America Uncovered.